The champagne in my glass was exactly 42 degrees, a perfect chill designed to mask the humid weight of the Miami night. Yet as I stood on the upper deck of the Azure Grace, the liquid felt like lead in my stomach. I remember the way the sea salt clung to my skin, mixing with the expensive scent of bergamot and the faint, metallic tang of the yacht's engine hum. This vessel, my $12 million sanctuary, was glowing under the harbour lights like a jewel carved from the moon itself. It was supposed to be a night of celebration. It was supposed to be the moment I finally saw my daughter Chloe step into the light of the woman I had spent 30 years raising her to be. But the air felt thin, or maybe it was just me. My chest felt tight, a familiar ghost of a sensation that always appeared when I sensed a storm brewing on the horizon. Thomas used to say that I could smell a gale before the clouds even formed. My late husband was always right about my instincts, but I prayed to God that tonight, for once, I was wrong. I looked across the deck and saw Chloe. She was radiant in a dress that cost more than most people's annual salary, a shimmering silver piece that caught every flicker of the party lights. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her hand resting lightly on Julian's arm. Julian, my son-in-law, was the picture of a Florida aristocrat, all tanned skin and tailored white linen, his smile wide and blinding. They looked like the perfect couple on the cover of a magazine. Beside them stood Beatrice, Julian's sister, whose sharp eyes were constantly scanning the crowd as if she were tallying the net worth of every guest. The Montgomery family, Julian's parents, were nearby, holding court with a group of investors. They were a family of old names and empty bank accounts, though I had been too blinded by Chloe's happiness to see the hollowness behind their pedigree when they first walked into our lives 3 years ago. The music was a soft, rhythmic jazz that seemed to pulse through the very floorboards of the deck. I felt the vibration in the soles of my feet, a grounding sensations that reminded me that every inch of this teak wood, every screw in this hull, had been paid for with the sweat of my own brow. Thomas and I had started with nothing but a single rusted fishing boat in Key West. We had spent decades hauling nets in the dark, our fingers numb from the cold and our skin leathered by the sun, building a shipping empire dollar by dollar. When he died, the Azure Grace was the final gift he left me, a promise of a quiet life on the water. I had loved this ship more than I loved the land itself. It was the only place where I could still hear his voice in the wind. "Diane, darling, you look so lonely over here by the railing," Beatrice said as she glided toward me, her voice a sharp contrast to the gentle music. She didn't wait for an invite. She never did. Her presence was like oil on a calm sea, spreading and slick. "We were just talking about how much work it must be for you to keep this beauty running at your age. All that maintenance, the crew, the logistics. It must be exhausting for a woman who has already done so much." I turned to her, forcing a smile that felt like it was made of dry paper. "I manage just fine, Beatrice." "The salt water keeps me young," I replied. She let out a short, dry laugh and adjusted the diamond necklace that I knew was a rental. "Of course you do. But Chloe and Julian were saying that maybe it is time for a change, a different kind of pace. You know, something more grounded." Before I could ask what she meant by grounded, Chloe appeared beside her, her eyes sparkling with an intensity that I had never seen before. It wasn't joy, it was ambition. "Mum, there you are," she exclaimed, grabbing my hand. Her fingers were cold. "Julian and I have a surprise for everyone. We were going to wait until the cake, but the energy tonight is just too perfect." She didn't wait for me to respond. She pulled me toward the center of the deck, where a microphone had been set up. The music died down, and the chatter of the 200 guests faded into a hushed, expectant silence. Julian stepped up beside her, his hand possessively on the small of her back. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. "Attention, everyone!" Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, confident and smooth. "We want to thank you all for joining us tonight on the Azure Grace. This ship has always been a symbol of the Sterling family legacy, but tonight, we are moving into a new chapter." Chloe stepped closer to the microphone, her voice steady and clear. "As many of you know, my mother has dedicated her life to building this empire. She has worked harder than anyone I know. But the sea is a demanding mistress, and at 65, we want her to enjoy the peace she truly deserves. That is why, tonight, we are announcing my mother's official retirement from the water." A light applause broke out among the guests, but I felt like the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. Retirement. I had never spoken of retirement. Chloe continued, her smile never wavering. "Julian and I, along with the Montgomery family, will be taking over the management and ownership of the Azure Grace. We have decided that it is best for Mom to relocate to a beautiful, quiet apartment in the suburbs of Miami, away from the stress of the harbor. The Montgomerys will be moving onto the yacht full-time to help us oversee the new charter business we are launching next month. We want to make sure the Sterling name continues to shine, but in younger, more capable hands." The silence that followed in my own head was deafening. I looked at the faces of the guests, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and awkwardness. I looked at Julian's parents, who were nodding in approval, their faces smug and victorious. I looked at Beatrice, who was already eyeing the master cabin as if she were deciding on new curtains. And then I looked at Chloe, my daughter, the little girl who used to hide in my arms when the thunder was too loud. She was looking at me, but she wasn't seeing me. She was seeing a piece of property that had finally been moved out of the way. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat was tight, choked by a sense of betrayal so profound it felt like a physical blow to the solar plexus. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," I finally whispered, my voice cracking. "Chloe, I never agreed to this." Chloe leaned in close, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper that only I could hear. "Don't make a scene, Mum. We already talked about this. You signed the papers 3 weeks ago. The healthcare proxy, the asset management forms. Julian had his lawyers look them over. It is all legal. You're tired, Diane. Just let it go." 3 weeks ago, I remember. I had been recovering from a bad bout of the flu, my head foggy with fever and medication. Chloe had brought me a stack of papers, telling me they were just standard updates for the company insurance, a way to make sure I was taken care of if I got sick again. I had trusted her. I had signed them without a second thought because she was my daughter. I had handed her the keys to my kingdom while I was too weak to hold them. Julian made a signal to 2 men standing by the gangway. They were dressed in black suits, looking more like bouncers than yacht crew. They began to walk toward me with a synchronized, purposeful gait. "Mrs. Sterling," Julian said, his voice now cold and professional, projecting to the crowd. "We have a car waiting for you at the dock. We thought it would be best for you to get settled into your new home tonight, while we handle the rest of the festivities. We didn't want the transition to be too emotional for you." I looked at Chloe, my eyes pleading for a sign of the daughter I knew, but her face was a mask of cold efficiency. She turned away from me, lifting her glass to the crowd. "To the future of the Montgomery Sterling partnership," she announced. The 2 men in black reached me. One of them placed a firm hand on my elbow. The grip was strong, unyielding. It was the grip of a stranger on my own ship. "Please, ma'am, let us escort you to the car," the man said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I looked around the deck, at the luxury I had built. at the memories of Thomas that were embedded in every polished surface. I was being evicted from my own life. I was being erased in front of the very people I had spent years trying to impress for Chloe's sake. I found my voice, though it was small and trembling. "This is my ship," I said, looking at Julian. "I paid for every inch of it." Julian stepped forward, leaning in until I could smell the expensive gin on his breath. "Not anymore, Diane. You're just a guest who has overstayed her welcome. Now go quietly, or we will have to explain to everyone here exactly why you are no longer mentally fit to manage your own affairs. We have the papers, remember? Don't force us to use the darker ones." I felt the blood drain from my face. They had planned this for months. They had waited for me to be weak, and they had struck with the precision of a shark. I looked at Chloe one last time, but she was already busy talking to a group of Beatrice's friends, her laughter ringing out across the water like a death knell. I let the men lead me toward the gangway. Every step felt like I was walking into an abyss. My knees were shaking, and I had to grip the railing to keep from falling. I passed the Montgomerys, who watched me with a cold, detached curiosity. I passed Beatrice, who smiled a thin, cruel smile as I went by. I reached the dock and felt the solid, unyielding concrete under my feet. It felt wrong. It felt like the earth was rejecting me. I turned back to look at the azure grace. The ship was glowing, the music had started up again, and the party was continuing as if I had never existed. I saw my daughter on the top deck, her shimmering dress reflecting the lights of the city. She didn't look down. She didn't look back. The black town car was waiting, its engine idling with a low, menacing growl. The driver opened the door, his face hidden in the shadows. I looked at the yacht one last time, the name Azure Grace, painted in elegant gold letters across the stern. Thomas's dream. My life's work. It was sailing away into the night, and I was standing on the shore with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart that was beating with a cold, terrifying clarity. They thought I was finished. They thought they had broken an old woman and tucked her away in a quiet corner to die in silence. They thought they had won because they had the papers and the lawyers and the youth. But as the car door closed and the lights of the harbour began to fade in the distance, a different kind of sensation began to stir in my chest. It wasn't pain anymore. It wasn't even shock. It was a low, burning heat that started in my gut and spread through my veins like fire. Thomas always said I was the salt of the earth, and salt doesn't just preserve. It stings, it burns, and it never, ever disappears. I sat back in the darkness of the car, my eyes fixed on the retreating silhouette of my ship. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just waited for the fire to take hold. They had kicked me off my yacht, but they had forgotten one very important thing. I was the one who knew where all the leaks were, and I was the one who knew exactly how to make a ship sink without anyone ever seeing the hole. The car moved into the Miami traffic, the neon lights of the city blurring into a kaleidoscope of colors. I closed my eyes and whispered a single name into the darkness. Thomas. I felt a faint phantom touch on my shoulder, a breath of wind that smelled of the deep ocean. I wasn't alone. I was just getting started. Wait for me, Chloe, I thought, the words cold and sharp in my mind. Wait for the tide to turn. Because when it does, not even your silver dress will be enough to keep you from drowning. I watched the city pass by, each skyscraper a monument to a world I no longer belonged to. I thought about the healthcare proxy, about the asset management forms, about the way Chloe's voice had sounded when she lied to me. Every detail was being etched into my memory, a map for the war that was about to begin. I wasn't going to a quiet apartment to rest. I was going to a bunker to plan. They had stolen my ship, but they had left me my mind. And in the end, that was the most dangerous weapon of all. The car pulled up to a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. It was a place of beige walls and tired palm trees, a world away from the glamour of Key West. The driver got out and opened my door. He didn't offer to help with my bag, mainly because I didn't have one. I had been kicked off my yacht with nothing but my purse and my champagne glass, which I realized I was still clutching in my hand. I stepped out of the car and looked at the building. My new prison. I tightened my grip on the glass until I thought it might shatter. "Welcome home, Mrs. Sterling," the driver said, his voice dripping with a fake, practiced empathy. I didn't answer. I just walked towards the door, my heels clicking on the pavement with a steady, rhythmic sound. It sounded like a countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The storm was here, and I was the only one who knew how to sail through it. The silence in this apartment is not the silence of the sea. On the Azure Grace, the silence was always alive. It breathed with the rhythm of the waves, the subtle creak of the hull, the distant, comforting heartbeat of the generators. Here, in this beige-walled box on the edge of a city that feels like a stranger, the silence is dead. It is heavy, smelling of stale air and the chemical scent of cheap carpet cleaner. I sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, staring at my hands in the dim glow of a street lamp filtering through the plastic blinds. These hands. They were rough once, calloused from hauling lines and scrubbing decks in the humidity of the quays. I had spent 30 years turning those calluses into the soft skin of a woman who owned an empire, only to find that the softness had made me vulnerable. The jewelry Thomas had bought me was still on my wrists, the gold feeling like shackles. "I am Diane Sterling," I told myself, but the name sounded hollow in the empty room. I was a woman who had been erased by a signature, a ghost haunting a life that had been stolen by the very person I had lived for. I remember the day I signed those papers. It was 3 weeks ago, a Tuesday that started with a grey fog clinging to the water. I had been trapped in my cabin for days, the flu racking my body with shivers that made my bones feel like they were made of glass. My head was a kaleidoscope of fever dreams and the bitter taste of cough syrup. Chloe had come in, her face a mask of tender concern that I now realize was nothing more than a predator's patience. She had sat on the edge of my bed, stroking my hair, her voice a low, soothing hum. "Mum, you need to rest," she had whispered. "Everything is a mess at the office, and the insurance companies are breathing down our necks because you're not there to sign the renewals. I've brought the standard updates. Just sign them so Julian can handle the bureaucrats and you can sleep." I had looked at her, my eyes blurry and watering, and I saw only my daughter. I saw the toddler who used to cry when she scraped her knee. I saw the teenager I had shielded from every harsh truth about the world. I didn't see the silver-clad stranger who would eventually stand on my deck and tell the world I was incompetent. I took the pen. It was a heavy, gold-plated thing, a gift from Julian, and I signed my name over and over. Every stroke was a nail in my own coffin. Every signature was a wave of the white flag. How could she? The question looped in my mind like a broken record. Chloe was the sun in my sky after Thomas died. When the heart attack took him in the middle of a Tuesday morning, leaving me standing in our kitchen with a half-made pot of coffee and a hole in my soul, Chloe was the only thing that kept me from walking into the ocean and never coming back. I worked those 12-hour days for her. I fought the predatory shipping magnates and the crooked dock unions for her. I built the Sterling name into a fortress so she would never have to know the sting of poverty or the indignity of being ignored. I had given her a life of private schools, summers in Europe, and the finest silks, thinking I was giving her a foundation. I didn't realize I was building her a pedestal from which she could look down on me. I had raised a princess, and she had grown up to be a usurper. And Julian, that smooth-talking, linen-wearing leech, he had appeared in Chloe's life like a dream, a man with a pedigree that matched the Montgomery name, a family that had been in Florida since the days of the Spanish land grants, or so they claimed. I had seen the way he looked at the Azure Grace the first time he stepped on board. It wasn't the look of a man who appreciated the craftsmanship or the history. It was the look of a man measuring the square footage of a trophy. Thomas would have smelled him a mile away. Thomas would have seen the desperation behind that blinding white smile, and the way his eyes never quite settled when the conversation turned to hard numbers. But I was tired of being the Iron Woman. I wanted Chloe to be happy. I wanted to believe that the Sterling legacy was safe. I had invited the fox into the henhouse and handed him the keys, thinking he was the guardian. Beatrice, with her rented diamonds and her sharp, hungry gaze. She was already talking about the master cabin. My cabin. The place where Thomas's scent still lingered in the mahogany drawers. The place where I kept the small, tattered photograph of our first boat, the one we had named the Lucky Penny. They would throw it all away. They would strip the azure grace of its soul and turn it into a floating showroom for Julian's delusions of grandeur. The Montgomerys, those crumbling relics of a dead era, were probably already sleeping in my linens, drinking the vintage scotch Thomas had saved for our 40th anniversary. The thought made my stomach churn with a fresh wave of nausea. It wasn't just the theft. It was the desecration. They were treating my life's work like a carcass to be picked clean. I stood up and walked to the small kitchenette. It was a pathetic space, the counters made of cheap laminate that had started to peel at the edges. I turned on the tap, and the water came out in a hesitant, rusty stream. I reached into my purse, my fingers brushing against the cold, hard surface of the champagne glass I had subconsciously carried off the yacht. I looked at it in the moonlight, a delicate, crystal flute, still smudged with my lipstick, a relic of a night that had ended in exile. I set it on the counter, and the sound of the glass hitting the laminate was a dull, miserable thud. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. I saw an old woman. My hair was disheveled, the expensive bergamot scent now a faint, mocking ghost of the woman I was 2 hours ago. My eyes were red and tired, but deep inside the pupils, there was a spark. It was the same spark Thomas used to see when the fish were running and the nets were heavy. It was the spark of a survivor. I thought back to the boat Thomas and I started with. The Penny. She was a rusted, leaking bucket that smelled of diesel and old bait, but she was ours. I remember one night, a storm had caught us 10 miles off the coast of Key West. The waves were 15 feet high, crashing over the bow, the wind screaming through the riggings like a banshee. Thomas was at the wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw set in a line of pure iron. "Diane!" he had shouted over the roar of the sea. "The ocean only takes the ones who forget they belong to the earth. Hold the line!" We had held that line together, soaked to the bone, our lungs burning with salt, until the sun broke over the horizon. We had built an empire from that one night of defiance. If Thomas could see me now, huddled in this beige room, he wouldn't see a victim. He would see a captain who had been mutinied against. And he would remind me that a captain's first duty is to the ship, no matter who is trying to sink it. The enhuknya, the shame of being escorted off my own deck in front of my peers. I could still see the faces of the investors, the socialites, the people I had invited into my home. I could see the way they looked away, their eyes filled with that terrible, polite pity. They thought I was a senile old woman who had finally lost her grip. They would go home and talk about the sad end of the Sterling era, They would toast to Chloe and Julian, the new kings of the harbour, while I was forgotten in the suburbs. The Montgomery family would spread the narrative that I was mentally unfit, using the flu-induced fog of 3 weeks ago as their evidence. They would use my own vulnerability as the weapon to destroy my reputation. Julian's lawyers would have everything tightened, every loophole closed. They had the papers, they had the law, but they didn't have the salt. I walked over to the small, tattered suitcase that the driver had tossed onto the floor before he left. I hadn't even realized I had a suitcase until now. I opened it and saw a chaotic jumble of my things. Clothes Chloe had obviously thrown together in a hurry. My silk blouses were wrinkled, my shoes tossed in without their bags. But at the very bottom, tucked under a heavy sweater, my hand hit something hard and rectangular. I pulled it out. It was Thomas's old leather-bound logbook from the early days of Sterling shipping. I had kept it in the safe in the master cabin. Arthur, the ship's old boatswain and my most trusted friend for 40 years, must have slipped it in when the men in black were distracting me. Arthur. He had been there when we bought the Penny. He had been there when we launched the Azure Grace. He was the only one who knew the Sterling business as well as I did. I opened the logbook, the smell of old paper and salt filling the small room. I flipped through the pages, seeing Thomas's steady, rhythmic handwriting. Logs of fuel costs, weather patterns, and cargo weights. But as I reached the very back, I saw a loose sheet of paper tucked into the binding. It was a note, written in Arthur's shaky but precise script. Diane, the tide always goes out before it comes back in. They found the safe, but they didn't find the floorboards. I took what mattered. I'm at the old dock house in Key West. Don't let the silence fool you. The ship is still yours. Come home. I felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath. The floorboards. Thomas had always been a man of secrets, a man who knew that a successful business was a target. He had built a hidden compartment into the hull of the Azure Grace, a space that only he and I knew existed. It held the original titles, the handwritten agreements with the Key West unions, and something else, a contingency plan he had drafted years ago when Chloe first started dating Julian. He had never liked the Montgomerys. He had seen the hollow eyes of the hungry aristocrat in Julian long before I did. The low, burning heat in my gut flared into a steady flame. I looked back at the crystal flute on the counter. It was stained with the lipstick of a woman who had been defeated. I picked it up and walked to the window. I looked out at the lights of Miami, far in the distance, where my ship was currently hosting a party for thieves. I am not an old woman in retirement, I whispered to the empty room. I am the captain, and I am going to reclaim my ship. I looked at my hands again. They weren't just soft skin anymore. They were the hands that had built a legacy. They were the hands that were going to tear down the Montgomery-Sterling partnership brick by brick, or in this case, plank by plank. Chloe had played her hand, Julian had played his, but they had forgotten that a game of chess on the water is played by different rules. They had the papers, but I had the history, I had the truth, and I had the salt that was now stinging my eyes, not as tears of grief, but as the sweat of a new war. I closed the logbook and packed it back into the suitcase. I didn't need the expensive blouses or the designer shoes. I needed my boots. I needed my resolve. I looked at the beige walls one last time. They weren't a prison. They were a staging ground. The Montgomerys thought they had tucked me away to fade into the background, but they were about to find out that Diane Sterling was never a woman who stayed in the shadows. The Azure Grace was calling to me, her spirit still tied to mine through the salt and the sea. Arthur was waiting. Thomas was watching. And the The tide was finally starting to turn. The dawn didn't break in Miami. It just leaked through the smog, a sickly grey light that offered no warmth to the cold beige room. I didn't wait for the sun. I had spent the night staring at the logbook, tracing Thomas's handwriting until my fingers felt the phantom vibrations of his heartbeat. By 4 o'clock in the morning, I had made my move. I left the designer heels behind. I stripped off the burgundy silk dress, the one Chloe had bought me, no doubt with my own money, and left it in a heap on the floor like a discarded skin. I found an old pair of denim jeans and a heavy flannel shirt in that chaotic suitcase, remnants of my life before I became a trophy mother. I looked in the mirror, and for the first time in years, I didn't see Mrs. Sterling of the Azure Grace. I saw Diane, the girl from the docks. My face was pale, my eyes sunken, but there was a hardness in my jaw that I hadn't felt since Thomas and I were living on $5 a day and a prayer. I slipped out of the apartment before the guards Julian had stationed downstairs could finish their shift. They weren't looking for an old woman in a baseball cap and a tattered jacket, carrying a single duffel bag. They were looking for a broken socialite. I walked 3 miles to the Greyhound station, my joints aching with every step, the humidity of South Florida already clinging to me like a shroud. The bus station was a purgatory of neon lights and the smell of burnt coffee and desperation. I sat on a plastic bench, my hand gripping the strap of my bag, watching the travelers. I was Diane Sterling, a woman whose name once opened the doors of every bank in the city, and here I was, counting out $28.50 for a one-way ticket to Key West. The indignity didn't sting anymore. It functioned as fuel. I took my seat in the back of the bus, the vinyl smelling of ancient cigarettes, and as the engine groaned to life, I felt the first real tether to my life being severed. I was drifting, but for the first time, I was the one holding the rudder. The drive down the overseas highway was a blur of turquoise water and sun-bleached concrete. Every bridge we crossed felt like a mile further away from the trap Chloe had set. I watched the water, the familiar shades of emerald and sapphire that Thomas and I had navigated for 30 years. I saw charter boats and luxury yachts, their white hulls gleaming, and I felt a sharp, jagged pain in my chest. One of those could have been the Azure Grace. Chloe was probably waking up in my cabin right now, Julian's parents probably complaining about the salt air while they planned how to liquidate my shipping accounts. Arthur's note was a heavy weight in my pocket. The ship is still yours. I needed to believe him. If I didn't have the ship, I had nothing but a beige room and a daughter who had traded her soul for a Montgomery crest. Key West hit me with the scent of jasmine and rot, the true smell of the tropics. I got off the bus and walked toward the old harbour, avoiding the tourist traps of Duval Street. My feet knew the way better than my mind did. I passed the fancy new boutiques and the sanitized marinas until the air grew thick with the smell of diesel and fish scales. The old dock house was a weathered shack at the end of a crumbling pier, a place the city planners had been trying to condemn for a decade. It was the place where Thomas and I had signed our first commercial contract. It was home. Arthur was sitting on a rusted oil drum, a cigarette dangling from his lip, his hands covered in engine grease. He looked 100 years old, his skin like parched leather, but his eyes were as sharp as a hawk's. He didn't say a word when he saw me. He just stood up, wiped his hands on a filthy rag, and opened the door to the shack. The inside was a chaotic library of nautical charts, rusted tools, and the low hum of an old shortwave radio. "You took your time, Diane," he grunted, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed. "I had to wait for the tide to turn, Arthur," I replied, sitting on a wooden stool that creaked under my weight. He didn't offer me tea or sympathy. Arthur wasn't built for comfort. He walked over to a corner of the room, kicked aside a pile of tattered nets, and pried up a loose floorboard. From beneath the wood, he pulled out a heavy metal lockbox. He set it on the table between us with a thud that echoed in the small space. Thomas wasn't a fool, Diane. He knew Julian was a shark long before the wedding. He spent the last 6 months of his life digging, Arthur said, his eyes fixed on the box. He didn't tell you because he didn't want to break your heart. He thought he could handle it quietly, but the heart attack got him before he could close the net. My hands shook as I reached for the box. What did he find, Arthur? Julian isn't just a Montgomery with an empty bank account. He's a hole in the ground, Arthur spat. He owes money to people you don't want to know. Real estate scams in the Caribbean, bad investments in offshore drilling. Thomas found evidence that Julian has been siphoning money from Sterling Shipping for over 2 years, well over $900,000, using Chloe's access codes. He wasn't marrying her for love. He was marrying her for a bailout. I opened the box. Inside were ledgers, bank statements, and a series of photographs. I saw Julian meeting with men in dark suits in back alleys of Nassau. I saw wire transfer receipts from my corporate accounts to shell companies I had never heard of. But the most devastating thing was a document at the bottom, a life insurance policy Julian had taken out on me. Not for $500,000, but for $5 million. The policy was dated 2 days after Thomas's funeral. The abyssal floor. That's where I was. I felt the breath leave my lungs, the walls of the shack closing in on me. My daughter wasn't just a spoiled socialite. She was an accomplice. Or maybe she was a victim too. No, I remembered her face on the deck. I remembered the cold, calculated way she told me I was incompetent. She had to know. She had seen the papers. She had signed the proxy. She was letting him drain her own heritage to pay for his sins. The ship, Arthur, I whispered, my voice sounding like it was coming from a mile away. What about the floorboards in the hull? Arthur leaned in, his face inches from mine. That's the beauty of it, Diane. Julian thinks he has the title because he has that forged transfer you signed in your fever. But Thomas never put the Azure Grace under the corporate name. He kept it in a private trust, registered in the Cayman Islands under your maiden name. The papers in that hull, they are the only ones that matter. If you get those papers, you prove Julian's transfer is a forgery. You prove he's a thief, and you get your ship back. But they have guards, I said, thinking of the men in black. Julian has a security detail. They won't let me within a mile of the harbor. They're searching for you now, Arthur warned, pointing to the shortwave radio. I heard the chatter on the security frequencies. They know you left the apartment. Julian has a black SUV circling the quays as we speak. He doesn't want you reaching the docks. He wants you protected in a facility where you can't talk to anyone. The realization hit me like a freezing wave. I wasn't just being evicted. I was being hunted. Julian knew that if I regained my strength, I would find the holes in his story. He needed me silenced. He needed me to be the confused old woman, forever. I need to get to the Grace, I said, my voice hardening. I don't care about the guards. That ship is the only thing I have left of Thomas. You can't go through the front door, Diane. You're a ghost now. You have to move like one, Arthur said. He reached behind the door and handed me a heavy, grease-stained jumpsuit. Put this on. You're going to be a part of the night shift cleaning crew. I have a friend at the marina who owes Thomas his life. He'll get you on the dock. But after that, you're on your own. I took the jumpsuit, the rough fabric feeling like armor. I looked at the photographs of Julian again, the evidence of his betrayal laid out like an autopsy. I thought about Chloe, my beautiful, shimmer-dressed daughter, and I felt a grief so deep it threatened to swallow me whole. But beneath the grief, the fire was still burning. It was a cold fire now, a blue flame that demanded justice. As I was changing into the jumpsuit, a low, rumbling sound echoed from the pier. Arthur moved to the window, his hand going to a heavy wrench on the table. "Black SUV," he whispered. "They're here." My heart hammered in my chest. I looked at the back door of the shack, a rotting piece of wood that led directly into the mangroves. "Go, Diane," Arthur said, his eyes filled with a fierce loyalty. "Get to the harbour. I'll hold them off. Tell them I haven't seen you since the wedding. I'll be the old senile drunk they expect me to be." "Arthur, no." "Go," he hissed. "Hold the line, Diane, for Thomas." I grabbed the duffel bag, stuffed the metal box inside, and slipped out the back door. I felt the mud of the mangroves squelch under my boots, the salt air stinging my eyes. I didn't look back. I moved through the thick, tangled roots, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I heard the sound of car doors slamming, the sharp, barking voices of men demanding information. I heard the sound of a struggle, a muffled grunt, and then the heavy silence of the night. I was alone in the darkness, a 65-year-old woman in a grease-stained jumpsuit, running through the swamp with the evidence of $1 million crime in her bag. I reached the edge of the mangroves and saw the lights of the Miami Key West harbor in the distance. The Azure Grace was out there, her white hull a beacon in the dark. She was surrounded by enemies, her deck crawling with thieves and vultures. But she was still mine. I looked at my hands, now covered in mud and grease. I was no longer Diane Sterling, the socialite. I was Diane, the hunter. I started to walk toward the lights, my heels no longer clicking, my footsteps silent on the damp earth. Julian thought he had won because he was young and strong and backed by a name. But he had forgotten that the ocean doesn't care about names. It only cares about the ones who know how to survive the storm. I reached the perimeter fence of the marina, my eyes scanning the shadows for the security detail. I saw the black SUV idling near the main gate, its headlights cutting through the fog. I saw the men in black, their earpieces glowing blue in the dark. They were looking for a victim. They weren't prepared for a mother who had nothing left to lose. "I am the salt," I whispered to the wind, "and tonight I am coming home." I found the gap in the fence that Arthur had told me about, a narrow space behind a stack of shipping containers. I squeezed through, the jagged metal tearing at my jumpsuit, the smell of diesel and sea salt filling my lungs. I was inside the wire. I was a shadow in the engine room of my own life. "Chloe, Julian, enjoy your party," I thought, as I watched the lights of the Azure Grace flicker in the distance. "Enjoy the champagne. Enjoy the master cabin. Because the tide is coming back in. And when it reaches you, there won't be enough lifeboats in the world to save you from the woman you tried to bury." I moved toward the docks, my body low, my eyes fixed on the gold letters of my ship's name. The war had moved from the boardroom to the harbour, and in the harbour, I was the one who held the home court advantage. I felt Thomas's presence beside me, a phantom captain at my shoulder. We had built this ship to withstand hurricanes. Julian and his silver-dressed princess were about to find out exactly what happens when the hurricane comes from inside the hull. The Azure Grace loomed over me like a titan of white steel and shattered promises, its hull reflecting the oily shimmer of the Miami harbor. I stood in the deep shadows of the secondary service dock, the grease-stained jumpsuit heavy and stiff against my skin, smelling of old diesel, hydraulic fluid, and the bitter salt of a life I was fighting to reclaim. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, hammering with a rhythm so loud I feared the security guard. A thick-necked man Julian had hired from a private firm could hear it from 30 feet away. Above me, the lights of the party were a mocking halo. I could hear the rhythmic thumping of the bass, the high-pitched neigh of social climbers, and the distinct, melodic clinking of crystal flutes. That was my champagne they were drinking. $900 a bottle, aged in cellars I had curated, now being poured down the throats of people who would celebrate my demise before the appetizers were even finished. I wasn't just Diane Sterling anymore. I was a stowaway in the engine room of my own existence. I watched the guard turn his back to check his watch, the orange glow of a cigarette ember momentarily lighting his face. I knew the rhythm of this boat better than I knew the lines on my own face. I was the one who had insisted on the placement of every security camera 5 years ago. I knew the blind spots. I knew the exact 3-second window where the lens rotated away from the lower service hatch near the bilge. Moving with a sudden, desperate agility that ignored the protest of my 70-year-old joints, I slipped across the wet concrete. I reached the hatch, a heavy metal door that was supposed to be electronically locked, but Arthur's voice echoed in my head, reminding me that the latch had a tendency to slip if hit with enough force at the right angle. I used the heavy wrench he'd given me, the metal-on-metal clang sounding like a gunshot in my mind, but the party music swallowed it whole. The door gave way, and I slid into the darkness, the sudden silence of the interior hitting me like a physical weight. The air here was different. It was thick with the scent of diesel and the low, constant thudding of the generators, the heartbeat of the Grace. This was Thomas's domain. He used to spend hours down here, his hands black with soot, talking to the engines as if they were unruly children. "She's a living thing, Diane," he would say, his eyes twinkling under the grime. "If you don't listen to her heart, she'll break yours." I navigated the narrow, dimly lit gangways with the muscle memory of a ghost. I passed the crew quarters, hearing the muffled sound of a football game on a television. These were men and women I had hired, people I had given bonuses to every Christmas, yet now they were serving a man who had stolen their captain's ship. I felt a sharp pang of betrayal, a cold needle in my heart, but I suppressed it. They had families to feed. They didn't know the truth of the papers Chloe had forced under my pen while I was drifting in a feverish fog. I reached the service ladder that led to the subfloor of the lower deck, near the ballast tanks. This was the dark underbelly of the ship, a place where the Montgomerys and their silver-dressed princess would never dream of stepping. The heat was stifling, and the grease on the floor made every step a gamble. I knelt in the cramped darkness, the metal floor cold through my jumpsuit. "The third plank from the starboard ballast," I whispered, Thomas's voice guiding me through the gloom. I fumbled in my duffel bag for the heavy screwdriver Arthur had provided. My fingers were trembling so violently I nearly dropped it into the oily water of the bilge. Above me, I could hear the muffled, arrogant click of high heels. It was Beatrice. I could hear her sharp, nasal voice complaining to someone about the faint smell of oil that was ruining the ambience of the lower salon. "Julian really needs to sell this industrial relic and buy a modern cruiser," she snickered. "Something with more pedigree." Pedigree. I jammed the screwdriver into the seam of the teak floorboards, a surge of white-hot rage giving my old muscles a strength they shouldn't have possessed. I pried with everything I had, the wood groaning in a way that sounded like a scream in the quiet of the bilge. The board gave way. Beneath it, tucked into a waterproof steel cylinder, was Thomas's final insurance policy. I pulled it out, my chest heaving, the air in the subfloor feeling thin and metallic. Inside the cylinder were the original titles to the ship, the Cayman Island Trust documents, and a handwritten ledger that Thomas had kept for the last 18 months of his life. I opened it to the first page, and the words hit me like a splash of freezing water. For Diane, in case the sharks come circling. Thomas had been investigating Julian Montgomery long before the wedding. He had tracked the wire transfers, the systematic siphoning of $12 million from sterling shipping, disguised as consulting fees for the Montgomery estate. Julian wasn't just a man with an empty bank account. He was a black hole of debt. He owed money to creditors in Nassau, who didn't use lawyers to settle their accounts, men who dealt in blood and silence. Julian had been drowning, and he had used my daughter as his life raft. And Chloe. I looked at the ledger, at her access codes used for the transfers, and I felt a grief so profound it felt like my soul was being flayed. Had she known? Had my Bauvat, my treasure, been a willing participant in my erasure? Or had she been as blinded by his white linen charm as I was? I clutched the documents to my chest, the paper feeling more precious than any diamond I had ever owned. This was the proof. This was the anchor that would stop the drift. But as I started to replace the floorboard, a shadow fell across the narrow opening of the service ladder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my hand instinctively going to the heavy wrench. I thought I heard the Grace groaning in a way she only does for family, a voice said. It wasn't a guard. It was Marcus Vance, Thomas's old legal shark, a man Julian had forced into a shameful retirement 3 years ago after manufacturing a scandal. He was dressed in a worn tuxedo that had seen better days, his eyes scanning the darkness with the sharp intelligence of a predator who had been waiting in the tall grass. "Marcus," I whispered, emerging from the shadows like a grease-stained apparition. He jumped back, his eyes widening as he registered the woman in the jumpsuit. "Diane? My God, Diane. They told the world you were in a private psychiatric retreat in the desert. They said you'd had a total break after the wedding." "I'm at the retreat Julian built for me, Marcus," I said, my voice sounding like gravel being ground under a boot. "It's called Exile. But I found them. I found Thomas's floorboards." Marcus looked at the cylinder in my hand, and a slow, grim smile spread across his face. A smile that promised a bloodbath. So the old man really did it. He told me once that if he died, he'd leave the light on for you. I've been sneaking onto these parties for weeks, hoping to find a way to reach you, hoping to get into this hull myself. I knew Julian was liquidating the Key West holdings. I knew he was trying to move faster than the law. "They took everything, Marcus," I said, the words spilling out of me like blood. "The accounts, the legacy, the ship. Chloe, she told them I was incompetent. She helped him sign me away." Marcus grabbed my shoulders, his grip firm. "Listen to me, Diane. Julian is desperate. He's into the Russians for over $4 million, and they don't take apologies. That's why he needs the Azure Grace sold by Friday. He's already in talks with a shell company in Panama. Once that ship leaves American waters, the title is as good as gone, and you'll be a ward of the state forever. We have 48 hours. "How?" I asked, looking at the grease on my hands. "I'm a ghost. I have no standing. I have no money." "You have me," Marcus hissed. "I never retired, Diane. I just moved into the shadows to sharpen my teeth. I have the files Thomas sent me before he died, the ones he called contingencies. We have the wire fraud, the forgery, and now we have the original trust title that proves Julian's transfer is a legal fiction. But we need to move. Now. Julian has the harbor police on his payroll. If they find you here, they won't just take you back to that apartment. They'll make sure the eccentric Mrs. Sterling has a tragic accident in the harbor." The weight of the danger hit me, but it didn't paralyze me. It focused me. For the first time in weeks, the fog of the flu and the haze of grief were gone. I looked up at the ceiling, hearing the vibrations of the party above. Chloe was up there, laughing with the man who had murdered her father's legacy. Julian was up there, drinking the scotch of a man he had betrayed. I felt a surge of cold, calculating power. Wait, I said, a sudden memory surfacing. The anniversary scotch, the 30-year-old Macallan in the safe in the master cabin. Thomas told me that if the storm ever got so bad that the masts were snapping, I should look at the bottle. Marcus frowned. Diane, we don't have time for a drink. It's not for drinking, Marcus. Thomas never trusted digital safes. He trusted physical weight and old-fashioned mechanics. We navigated the corridors, moving like shadows toward the master suite. We reached the door just as Julian was speaking on his phone inside. His voice was tight, the charm stripped away to reveal a raw, ugly desperation. I don't care about the interest rates. Just get the Panama buyers to wire the 10 million by Friday morning. My mother-in-law? She's a non-issue. She's tucked away in a hole where she can't even remember the color of the water. Just do your job before the Russians decide my head looks better on a spike. I stood outside the door, my hand on the handle, a scream building in my throat. I wanted to burst in. I wanted to show him that the non-issue was standing right there, covered in the grease of the ship he didn't deserve. I wanted to see the terror in his eyes when he realized the captain was back. But Marcus pulled me back into the shadows. Not yet, Diane. The U-turn isn't complete. Let him feel invincible. That's when they stop looking for the leaks. We retreated back toward the service hatch. Marcus handed me a small burner phone. Go back to Arthur's shack in Key West. He knows where to hide you. I'm going to spend the next 24 hours filing every emergency injunction in the book. I'm going to freeze every account Julian thinks he owns. By the time the sun rises on Friday, Julian Montgomery won't be a shipping magnate. He'll be a target for a grand jury and a very angry group of creditors. And Chloe? I asked, the name feeling like a piece of glass in my mouth. Marcus looked at me with a sad, knowing expression. That's the part of the storm you have to sail through alone, Diane. She's a sterling. She'll have to decide if she wants to go down with Julian's sinking ship or swim to yours. But remember, the sea doesn't have room for people who hesitate. I slipped back out of the hatch, the night air hitting me with a sudden, refreshing coldness. I looked at the azure Grace one last time as I disappeared into the mangroves, her white hull shining like a beacon of stolen glory. I wasn't running away. I was pulling the cord on the life raft. Julian thought he was the new king of the harbour, but he was about to find out that a king without a hull is just a man drowning in expensive linen. The salt was stinging my eyes again, but this time it wasn't the salt of grief. It was the salt of a woman who was reclaiming her throne. I moved through the mud and the roots, my boots sinking into the earth. Thomas and I had worked so hard to claim. I wasn't just a mother. I wasn't just a widow. I was the captain. And in 48 hours, I was going to wash the Miami harbor clean of every Montgomery lie. I reached the perimeter fence, the metal cold and biting, but I barely felt it. I was Diane Sterling, and I was coming home. The stars were aligning over the Atlantic, and they were pointing directly at a reckoning that would make the Miami skyline tremble. Wait for me, Chloe. Wait for the tide. Because when it reaches you, not even your silver dress will be enough to keep you from the cold, deep truth of what you've done. The air in the Key West dockhouse felt like electricity before a lightning strike. I sat in the corner, the grease-stained jumpsuit, finally replaced by a robe Arthur had found for me, while Marcus Vance paced the floorboards like a caged tiger. The metal box I had pulled from the Grace sat open on the table, its contents, Thomas's secrets, laid out like an executioner's tools. Every 15 minutes, Marcus's phone would chirp. a digital signal that another link in Julian's chain had snapped. The freezing of the corporate accounts had been the first wave. The secondary injunction against the sale of the Azure Grace was the second. But the real blow, the one that would make the Montgomery Foundation crumble, was Marcus's direct line to the Treasury. By 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, Julian Montgomery wasn't just a man in trouble. He was a man being hunted by the very system he thought he could manipulate. I watched the sunset from Arthur's window, the orange and violet hues bleeding into the Atlantic. I thought about Chloe. I wondered if she had noticed the silence in the harbour office. I wondered if she had seen the way the crew looked at Julian when his credit cards were declined at the fuel dock. I could feel her confusion across the miles, the slow, creeping realization that the perfect world she had built with her silver-dressed prince was made of nothing but sand and stolen debt. I felt a sharp, hollow ache in my chest, a mother's instinct to protect the child who had just tried to bury her. But I choked it back. Thomas always said that you can't save a sailor who refuses to see the reef. Chloe had to see the crash. She had to feel the cold water of Julian's reality before she could ever appreciate the salt of mine. By Thursday night, the reports coming through Marcus were becoming chaotic. Julian was panicking. He had tried to move $3 million to a private account in the Caymans, only to find the door locked and the keys in Marcus's pocket. Beatrice had been seen screaming at a boutique manager on Lincoln Road when her limitless platinum card was swallowed by the machine. The Montgomerys, the proud, pedigree-heavy Montgomerys, were being stripped of their borrowed plumage in real time. But the most dangerous development was the Russians. Marcus's contacts reported that 2 black SUVs had been idling near the Miami harbor for hours. Julian's time had run out, and the Panama buyers were his only chance at survival. He was cornered, and a cornered man is a man who stops caring about the rules of the sea. "Tonight is the night, Diane," Marcus said, stopping his pacing to look at me. His eyes were hard, the legal shark finally scenting blood in the water. "Julian is hosting a final desperate gala on the Grace. He's calling it a partnership launch, but it's actually a closing ceremony for the Panama deal. He's planning to sign the final transfer at midnight. He thinks he can bypass the injunction if the money moves through a non-extradition bank before the sun rises. He needs that ship to sail by 1 o'clock a.m. "He's going to sail Thomas's ship into a black hole," I whispered, the fire in my gut flare up into a white-hot furnace. "Not if the owner shows up to stop him," Marcus replied, sliding a garment bag across the table. "I took the liberty of visiting your storage unit in Miami, the one Julian didn't know about. I think it's time Mrs. Sterling returned from her retreat." I opened the bag. Inside was the black silk evening gown I had worn to the opening of the Sterling Maritime Museum 3 years ago. It was a dress made of shadows and iron, a piece that commanded respect without saying a word. Beside it lay the sterling pearls, not a rental, but a legacy handed down through 3 generations of women who knew how to weather a gale. I looked at the dress, then at my hands, still faintly stained with the grease of the bilge. I wasn't just Diane, I was the captain. And tonight, I was going to claim my bridge. The drive back to Miami felt like a funeral procession for the man Julian used to be. I sat in the back of Marcus's sedan, the gold cylinder from the floorboards gripped in my lap like a scepter. I watched the neon lights of the city grow closer, the skyline shimmering with the false promises of wealth and power. My heart was steady now. The frantic bird had been replaced by a predator. I thought about the words I would say to Chloe. I thought about the look on Julian's face when he realized the non-issue was the one holding his life in her hands. We reached the harbor at 10 o'clock. The Azure Grace was a beacon of light against the dark water, the party in full swing. Julian had doubled the security, the men in black standing like sentinels at every entrance. But Marcus hadn't called the police. Not yet. He had called the press. He had called the very socialites Julian was trying to impress. He had turned the gala into a theatre, and I was the lead actress. "Are you ready, Diane?" Marcus asked as we pulled up to the main gangway. "Thomas is at the wheel, Marcus," I replied, stepping out of the car. The air hit me with a familiar scent, the mix of expensive perfume, salt spray, and the underlying metallic tang of the ship I loved. I walked toward the gangway, the black silk rustling against my legs like the sea itself. The security guard, the same thick-necked man from the night before, stepped forward to block my path. "I'm sorry, Ma'am. This is a private event," he said, his hand going to his earpiece. I didn't stop. I didn't even look at him. I simply reached into my purse and pulled out the original title document from the Cayman Trust. I held it up to his face, the gold seal of Thomas's legacy shining in the harbour lights. "I am Diane Sterling. I am the owner of this vessel, and you are trespassing on my property. Move, or Marcus Vance will have you in a deposition before the sun rises." The guard hesitated, his eyes darting to Marcus, who was standing behind me with a look that could freeze a hurricane. The pedigree of Julian's security crumbled instantly. He stepped aside, his face a mask of confusion and fear. I walked onto the deck, my heels clicking on the teak floorboards with a sound that felt like a heartbeat. The music was loud, a frantic, high-tempo pop that felt out of place on the Grace. I saw the Montgomerys first. Julian's parents were standing near the bar, their faces flushed with expensive wine, still oblivious to the tide that was rising around their ankles. Beatrice was nearby, flirting with a man I recognized as a representative for the Panama buyers. They were all vultures, waiting for the carcass to be sliced. Then I saw Julian. He was at the center of the upper deck, a fountain of false confidence. He was holding a pen, a legal document laid out on the table in front of him. Chloe was by his side, her silver dress now looking tarnished in the harsh glare of the party lights. She looked pale, her eyes scanning the crowd with a restless, hunted expression. She knew. Even if she didn't have the facts, she could feel the ship sinking. I reached the top of the stairs. The music didn't stop, but the silence began to spread from the center out, like ripples in a pond. One by one, the guests turned. They saw the woman who was supposed to be in a desert retreat. They saw the grease-stained ghost transformed back into the queen of the harbor. "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the pop music like a foghorn, "I believe you're holding my pen." The music died. Julian froze, the pen inches from the paper. He turned slowly, his face drained of color, his eyes widening with a terror that was almost beautiful to behold. "Diane," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be resting." "I've had plenty of rest, Julian," I said, walking toward him, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. "But it's hard to sleep when the rats are chewing on the hull. Chloe, darling, step away from the table. You don't want to be standing there when the floor gives way." Chloe looked at me, her mouth opening in a silent gasp. "Mum, they said you were sick. They said you had a breakdown." "The only thing that broke, Chloe, was my trust in you," I said, stopping 3 feet from the table. I looked at Julian, my eyes fixed on his like a shark's. "I found the floorboards, Julian. I found the transfers. I found the $5 million policy you took out on my life. And Marcus Vance has already delivered the evidence to the district attorney." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. The Panama buyers stepped back, their faces suddenly cold and detached. They were businessmen, They didn't stay for a sinking ship. Julian tried to regain his composure, his white linen charm flickering like a dying bulb. This is a misunderstanding. She's confused. Security, escort Mrs. Sterling off the vessel. She's not mentally fit. I'm fit enough to know that the title you're trying to sign over is a forgery, Julian, I said, slamming the gold cylinder onto the table. This is the original trust document. The Azure Grace was never part of Sterling Shipping. She's mine, personally. And since I didn't sign that transfer, your contract with the Panama buyers is worth exactly as much as your Montgomery pedigree. Nothing. Julian looked at the document, then at Marcus, then at the two black SUVs that had just pulled up to the dock, the Miami Harbor police stepping out with their sirens silent, but their intentions clear. The game was over. The Sharks had finally been caught in the net. Julian? Chloe's voice was a small, broken thing. She looked at her husband, seeing him for the first time without the shimmer of the Montgomery name. Is it true? The insurance? The siphoning? Julian didn't answer her. He didn't even look at her. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, the rage flared in his eyes. He reached for the document on the table, a last-ditch effort to destroy the evidence. But Marcus was faster. He grabbed the papers and stepped back, shielded by two harbor officers who had just reached the deck. Julian Montgomery, you are under arrest for wire fraud, forgery, and grand larceny, the lead officer announced, the handcuffs clicking into place with a sound that felt like the final chord of a symphony. The Montgomerys began to scream, their pedigree dissolving into a series of ugly, frantic protests. Beatrice tried to hide in the crowd, but the cameras of the press were already on her. The theatre was complete. The vultures were being led away in chains. I looked at Chloe. She was standing alone in the center of the deck, the silver dress reflecting the cold blue lights of the police cars. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a grief that I knew would take a lifetime to heal. "Mum," she whispered, stepping toward me. I didn't move. I didn't offer her my arms. Not yet. The tide had turned, and the Azure Grace was mine again, but the salt of betrayal was still stinging the air between us. "Go to the dock, Chloe," I said, my voice steady and iron-cold. "Arthur is waiting for you. He'll take you to the apartment Julian bought for me. You can spend the night there, and think about the color of the beige walls. Maybe then you'll understand what it feels like to be erased." Chloe looked at the ship, then at the harbor, then back at me. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply turned and walked toward the gangway, her shimmering dress trailing in the grease and salt of the deck. She was a Sterling again, but she was a Sterling who had to learn how to swim. The guests began to filter off the ship, their faces filled with the hushed excitement of those who had just witnessed a tragedy they could talk about for years. Marcus stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on the railing. "The ship is quiet, Diane," he said. "She's breathing again, Marcus," I replied, looking out at the dark water. I walked to the bridge, my heels silent now on the teak. I reached out and touched the wheel, the cold wood feeling like a handshake from Thomas. I was 65 years old, a Goa Fu, a survivor. I had been Suadoi Khoikwukdomin, but I had returned with the tide. I looked at the Miami skyline, the neon lights now looking small and insignificant. I had reclaimed my ship. I had cleared the Sterling name. And Julian Montgomery was heading to a place where linen suits and pedigree meant nothing. The salt was on my lips, but it wasn't the salt of tears. It was the salt of the sea. And as the moon rose over the Atlantic, I felt the Azure Grace lean into the wind, ready for the next voyage. The storm was over. The captain was back. And the horizon was finally clear.